Hello and welcome to Alan History. I hope component 1 and component 2 have gone well, and we've just got one left to go, which is component 3. I'm going to be looking at 3A, the unit on the USA, and it's a big unit. There's lots and lots to get through, so I'm going to try and get through it as quickly as I can. So in the last 2 years, I've produced videos looking at the advanced information in 2022, and then a revision video in 2023 that covered the stuff that wasn't in 2022. There is also a whole playlist with loads and loads of stuff covering all the different individual bullet points on the US module, and some of them have got multiple videos on them because there's so much in it. And so hopefully my channel will have everything that you need in terms of the US content. Look at those revision videos, they should cover all of it. This one then is going to try and draw a kind of a link back to where we are now. So where are we now? We don't have the advantage we've had before. So we had the advanced information, though it wasn't brilliantly useful, to be honest, on Unit 3 because, well, it didn't really miss anything out, or missed very little out, which actually meant the one that last year was really good because it was quite easy to spot the bits that they told us they were going to miss, and so that one worked quite well. The best preparation is always to go through the whole specification bullet point by bullet point. The slight difference with the US one is often they jump around, and you'll need a bullet point from over here and a bullet point from over there, and you'll need to bring them both together. The best bit is once you've gone through the spec and you've worked out which ones you're most or least confident on, is to concentrate on the areas where you've got some gaps. Make sure you're testing your knowledge, do flashcards, do knowledge dumps. All this is great for that. And there's always the old favourite of doing past paper questions to try and build your skills. Remember, timing's always a big one with this. This paper is different. The types of questions are different on paper 3 than they are on papers 1 and 2, and I'll talk about that as I go through. All the next bits come with a bit of a health warning. So I am going to look at the spread of past paper questions and what they've asked on. I'm going to talk about the different bullet points in the spec. I will point out gaps, trends, things like that, but that doesn't mean that I'm necessarily going to get it completely right. I have no special insider knowledge. And as I say, the best thing you can do is go through all of it. Examples aims to make their papers unpredictable, so teachers like myself and students like yourselves don't necessarily know exactly what's turning up every year. Right, so the first question on the paper is an explain 12 marker, 1A and 1B. So there are 2 questions, you choose one of them. The really special bit about this is there is no AO3, so you just need to know stuff and compare. They might ask you similarities, might ask you differences, or some kind of variation on that, and then you want to write about 3 very short paragraphs. You don't need an introduction, you don't need a conclusion. You're just going to go, right, they are different in this way. For example, in the US, this. In the UK, something different or something similar, and so on. And you can do that about 3 times, and that's where you get your 12 marks from. So it's just AO1 knowledge, AO2 comparison. So you can see there's been a range of stuff. So on the spec, there's 6.2.1, which is the constitutions and federalism. There's 6.2.3, which is the legislative bodies. There's 6.2.5, which is the executives. There's 6.2.7, which is the Supreme Court and rights. And there's 6.2.9, which is democracy and participation, which is kind of elections, political parties, and interest groups, or pressure groups, as we call them in the UK. So there's an awful lot in all of this. So there's been some nice ones. So we can see in 2019 they asked about federalism versus devolution, and they asked about the impact of rights of interest groups in the US and pressure groups in the UK. In 2020 we had limits on Congress and Parliament and roles of Prime Minister and President. In 2021 we had the nature of the constitutions and Supreme Court. The Supreme Court's now independent, now they're guaranteed independence. In 2022 we've got checks and balances on Congress and Parliament, which obviously is very, very different because there's very little check on the power of Parliament and quite a lot on the power of Congress. Methods and interests of the methods of interest and pressure groups in 2022 as well. And then last year we had a comparison with the Senate and the House of Lords, and comparing the policies of one main party from each. So you could compare, for example, the Republicans with the Conservative Party, or the Democrats with the Labour Party. So there's a whole lot of stuff. Now, I think these questions are relatively straightforward compared to the far more complicated stuff you have to do in the longer questions. But you need to go through and in all these areas think about how are they similar, how are they different, making sure you've got some sharp examples to back these different bits up, and don't get too carried away and write too much. So 12 marks will take you 15 minutes probably tops. If you get it under that, even better, gives you more time on your essays. There is no AO3, so there is no point you writing a conclusion about the degree of difference or the degree of similarity. It won't get you any marks. Those marks aren't there. In the question one, the explain one, 1A, 1B, you don't need to use any of the key theories. So it's just simple similarity or difference, whatever particular thing you are asked to do. Looking at the pattern, the sneaky example seems to have done bits from the same bit the last 2 years. So we've got Congress and Parliament checks and balances, followed by the powers of the Senate and House of Lords. We've got methods of interest groups and pressure groups, and the policies of the main parties. So interest and pressure groups, then parties. So they are different things, but they're from the same bit of the spec, which means constitutions, executive, and Supreme Court and rights seem to be more likely, I would guess, from the pattern, that the roles of something to do with the executive is quite possible, as it's not been on since 2020, and it's the only one that's only been on once. Everything else has been on 2 or 3 times, but who knows? So I would pay close attention to this. There should be loads of stuff that you have come across in all your study of components 1 and 2, just married with your revision for component 3. So hopefully nice and straightforward. Question 2 I always think is a bit trickier because you have to bring in one of the theories. So the theories are rational, structural, and cultural, and the question will be analysed. But again, there is no AO3. It's just AO1 and AO2. So it's A, do you know stuff, and do you understand at least one of the theories? And B, can you compare again the stuff in the 2 countries, and that's your AO2. There's only one question on this. It's quite unusual for this particular politics spec because everywhere else they give you choice. There is no choice here. You have to do question 2. Now, therefore they tend to be fairly mainstream topics that they do. So in 2019 we had Parliament versus Congress on the legislative powers. In 2020 we had how united the main parties are. 2021 we had a bit about whether the Senate has more power than the House of Lords. Yes, it does. I don't think that would get you full marks, by the way, but that's the general bit on that. The President is less effective than the Prime Minister in achieving legislative goals. Well, yes, they absolutely are. And then there's lots of stuff you can go into in terms of control of the over the legislature and all kinds of stuff like that. And then in 2023 we had whether the Prime Minister and the President have a similar role, which in a lot of ways that they do. There are lots of things that are similar. There are also differences, but if it's actually similar, you concentrate on similar. Right, you only have to use one of the comparative theories. My favourite, my absolute favourite on this, and those who I talk will know this all very well, is structural, because fundamentally the difference between US and UK politics is set up by their constitutions and the structures which they create. So we have a codified, entrenched constitution, and we have a kind of organic, unentrenched constitution which isn't codified. And there's lots of conventions and other things in it. And so the two fundamentally are very different. So if I'm explaining the differences in between the powers of presidents and prime ministers, then that is easily explained through the structures of the different system. I'm explaining the difference in between the powers and bits of the legislature. I can explain that through the structures and the way that the system is created, and in the way that the parties are set up as well. I can use that. So rational, really, you use if you're using doing about individuals and their choices. Cultural often is when you're looking at groups and the connections in there. So you can use those as well. You might want to get a bit from two of them in there maybe, but you only have to use one. There's not extra marks for using all three. Make sure you properly explain what the theory is and you relate it very much to the question. Again, looking at the pattern, we can see the last 2 years has been on the executives. We've also had 2 questions on the legislature in the past, and we've had 1 from democracy and participation. So Supreme Court and rights and constitutions are due because they've not been on there at all yet. So they might be ones to keep an eye out. Democracy and participation is an enormous section of the spec, and there's lots and lots of stuff in there. So interest and pressure groups, elections, all kinds of different things that could come out of that one as well. So there's plenty there to do. Again, don't worry too much about about having to think deeply about this one. You just need examples to show how the two systems work in similar ways or in different ways in all of these different bits. You have to know your different theories. My tip is, I think structural, when you're comparing the US and the UK, the structural one is always a nice go-to. It might not work on all questions, but on most questions, it's a nice go-to one. So I'm now going to deal with the main body of the spec, and we're going to look at the essays. So having done your 2 12 markers, you then have a choice of essays, and you're going to do 2 of them. Now with the essay section, they don't always just stick to one nice little bullet point in the spec, as I mentioned that earlier, and you'll see as we go through, you go, I recognise that bit before, he's just copied and pasted it, and the reason for that will be I've copied and pasted it because it actually fits with multiple bits of the specification. There are some bits, as with the other units, where it's easier, I think, to get a debate question out of it, notably normally the bits in 1.4 in the interpretations and debates bit. And we've seen there's quite a range. Again, you'll notice straight away in the Constitution Federalism one there's a gap in 1.1, but as we look at 1.1 in a minute, I'm not sure there's an enormous number of debates that come out of that one. There is plenty that come out of the features of 1.2 because checks and balances are in there. There's a massive amount of debate about in US politics. And we've got in 1.2 and in 1.3 reference to federalism, and federalism is a really important part of American politics, and again one where there is a very, very long ongoing debate. So the gap looks like it's in the interpretation and debates bit and in 1.1. So let's have a look at that part of the spec. Well, in 1.1 it says the nature of the US Constitution, vagueness of the document, codified and entrenchment, the constitutional framework, powers of the US branch of government, and the amendment process, including advantages and disadvantages of the formal process. Of all of those, I mean, there is also really interesting stuff about the vagueness of the document and how it then gets interpreted, which then feeds into the Supreme Court stuff later on. So that's a nice connection that could possibly be there. Quite noticeable one, I think, which it would make a good question about the amendment process. About you could ask whether it is too stringent, too demanding, too difficult to do. There's only been 27. 10 of those are the Bill of Rights, so that's 17 in over 200 years. 2 of those were on prohibition. So there isn't any the amendment process and the difficulty it causes. It doesn't have a massive impact on the American political system at all, particularly the power of the Supreme Court. 1.2, which is why there's been numerous questions on this, is about the key features of the US Constitution, and you have to evaluate their effectiveness to federalism, separation of powers and checks and balances, bipartisanship, and limited government. So again, separation of powers and checks and balances and federalism, there have been questions on. Bipartisanship and limited government, there haven't. So in that one, there are areas they could ask on. 1.3 is the main characteristics of federalism. Federalism, they think is so important they put it on there twice, because it's in 1.2 and 1.3. 1.3 is the nature of the federal system of government and its relationship with the states, and so you need to know about that and all the different types of federalism there has been over time. And then 1.4 is the interpretation of debates on the Constitution and federalism. So the extent of democracy within the US Constitution, its strengths, its weaknesses, impact on the US government, so anything about the strengths and weaknesses of the US Constitution, the way it's impacting on things that's in there. Debates around the extent to which the US remains federal today. Again, it is an area which they could delve into in more detail. You've learned the key bits about the Constitution, federalism, and then one of the most logical next steps is to make sure you know all the stuff about Congress, and that's what section 2 of this part of the spec is on. So you need to know about the structure, about its powers, about representation, about legislative oversight and debates. So so representation, legislature, and oversight are kind of the three main functions, and then debates kind of pulls a lot of that stuff together. There's a really good question on Congress last year about whether Congress is unrepresentative, and there's lots of really interesting data and stuff you could throw. That was a great question, a really interesting one where you can look at age and race and religion and all kinds of different things, and incumbency and all that kind of stuff. There's lots of good stuff to get your teeth into with representation. There is a noticeable gap in the powers of Congress, I think, which could be an area that they could pick up on. The bit kind of on structures, I mean, there's the procedures for electing US presidents and members of Congress, which was in 2019. Obviously, part of that comes into the structures of Congress, but they've done representative role. They did it in 2023 and 2022. They did, I think, something that would very much come over kind of oversight in terms of Congress protecting civil and constitutional rights. And again, this is one of those ones where you kind of go, I think that directly fits in section 2 on Congress, and obviously there's a lot more on rights in the Supreme Court section, but there is obviously a need to understand a load of stuff about Congress and have examples of things that Congress have done to be able to answer that question in 2022. Probably a harder question than the 23 one. And in 2021, there was a question on voting behaviour in Congress, so the divisions between the parties, where that was the most important reason why members of Congress vote as they do. So there have been questions on Congress. I say there's not been a kind of a really rich range of them. So the structure of Congress, so the bicameral nature, membership of Congress in the electoral cycles, which is why I connected that one, the election one, to that. And then you got 2.1.1, which is the distribution of power within Congress, powers given to the Congress in the Constitution, exclusive powers of each House, and the concurrent powers of Congress. There would be, I think, a really good potential question in terms of looking at the comparative power of the House and the Senate, and there's a lot of debate about kind of the level of difference there is between them. Obviously, in the UK, we're used to there being this massive gulf between the power of the House of Commons and the House of Lords. It's less clear cut. Now there are more exclusive powers for the Senate. There are much fewer of them, so much fewer members, that is, in the Senate. So I think there's a kind of a really good potential question on the distribution of power in Congress, and that's not one that has kind of a previous question on it, so that could be something they can ask. 2.2 in its different bits then looks at the different functions of Congress. So there's representation. There's a really good question on that. There could be a question about the significance of incumbency. So there has been questions before that's impacted on congressional elections. There was a direct question on representation last year. There has been a question on the factors affecting voting behaviour within Congress as well. So we can see that those bits all potentially have been asked on, and it shows again that paying attention to the spec is really important, because that's where the questions come from. So the legislative process would be, again, an area they can ask on, so the strengths and weaknesses of the process, and there is a kind of a big argument, isn't there, about how good Congress is at passing legislation. The short answer is not very, but there is a debate in there, and it's about whether you want lots of legislation to pass, or if you want that legislation to have had to go through rigor and get kind of bipartisan support. So something about linking with, again, a gap in the Constitution section on bipartisan support. And there's loads of stuff in recent years in the difficulty that Trump had and then Biden has had in passing legislation and getting it through with hostile chambers in Congress. So the policy significance of Congress, its impact, its effectiveness of the law it passes. Do you end up with good laws, or through things like pork barreling, do you end up with really ineffective, overbloated legislation, but they do all these various bits to get it through, and nobody's really happy, but they manage to get something through which is a bit of a mess. Is that the case, or is it kind of proper rigorous lawmaking? The next one is oversight 2.2.3. So effective relationship between Congress and the presidency, checks and balances of government and extent of institutional effectiveness. So does it stop the abuses by presidents and so on? There's been, I mean, again, there's so much stuff on that in recent years where we've had the impeachment of attempted impeachment of Trump twice. And so this idea of the oversight of the executive by Congress, it's something that's been really, really key in recent American politics. So that would be a good area for a question. And in the interpretation and debates around Congress, we've got the changing role of power of Congress and their relative importance, debates about adequacy of its representative role, changing significance of the parties in Congress, significance and effectiveness of powers outlined in the Constitution. So anything evaluating the effectiveness of Congress, they might bring in another institution to compare it against. Parties in Congress they can ask about, and the importance and how good it does in fulfilling its roles and how effectively it uses its power. Again, all good areas for questions, and we've seen some of these elements asked on, and some where there might be a bit of a gap. The presidency, they like the presidency, though they didn't ask about it last year. It's been in every other year, it's been in there a lot. So in 2019, we had a question about whether US foreign policy is dominated as much by Congress as by the presidency. Generally, normally, the way we would teach it is that the president dominates foreign policy, but Congress has important powers when it comes to power of the purse, power of declaring war, things like that, and oversight in terms of committees. In 2020, we've got presidential power of persuasion, and linking that with the policies and ideas of political parties. So it was the kind of the president section linked in with the politics and democracy section. The presidential appointments to the Supreme Court was also in 2020. So that's the kind of connection between president and Supreme Court. In the formal powers bit, we had a question in 2021, again connecting back to federalism. So rise in presidential power has led to a decline in federalism. So it's the president becoming more powerful, then the individual states have had less of a say in what's going on. And again, there's lots of debates we had about that, and that can also link into the limits on presidential power, because you can argue, well, there are bits the president gets into trouble if they overstep the mark, and there's a really nice example of that with Obama, with Obamacare, where the Supreme Court ruled that he was kind of overstepping his mark when he was threatening to remove funding for Medicare because if they weren't following the rules and regulations he put down. So there is a good debate in there, and there's a good question on that in 2021. In 2022. There was a question on whether the presidency is the most powerful kind of branch of government, the executive is the most powerful branch of government, and that would fit in with the 3.3.1, the relationship with both branches, and also in the debates. So there's lots in there, though notably not there in 2023. So whether the presidency is due a comeback this year on the paper would be an interesting one to think about, and I would definitely recommend you know your president stuff. And you've got loads of good examples. Now, with what we've had over recent years, I don't think that you should be struggling to find loads of examples of stuff that the presidents have got up to deal with these different themes. So in the spec, we've got the formal sources of presidential power set out in the Constitution. So head of state, head of government, and actually to know about the significance of these powers with reference to presidents since '92. Informal sources of presidential power, so electoral mandate, executive orders, and there's so many of those, hasn't there? I mean, if we think, I think Biden just sat in his office writing executive orders for the first couple of weeks he was in. He was in power. And the reliance on executive orders is a really big thing in American politics, with the difficulty of getting things through Congress. So that bit with the kind of legislative role of Congress, and you can flip that and kind of go, that's not working very well, and therefore what presidents are doing is they're putting things in place that last through their presidency through executive orders, but then are immediately reversed when we get a change in the White House. The role of the president in national events. Now, we've had lots of big ones of those. So, I mean, we might talk about January the 6th. You definitely could talk about COVID and all kinds of different things that have happened recently. And then there's obviously bigger things historically going backwards, like Bush with 9/11. And then the cabinet, and there's been lots of furore, for example, in Trump's presidency, the cabinet with the massive numbers of coming and going, and the cabinet is different in the US, which again might be something in question 1 or 2, where the cabinet can be kind of from anywhere, but they cannot also then sit in the legislative bodies. So you and then you've got the role where the president can choose cabinet members, but they have to be kind of confirmed by the Senate. Power of persuasion is a big one, including kind of the nature and characteristics of each president. So you actually need to know your presidents. So I think it's good having kind of a plan or part of your revision where you go through kind of significant things that different presidents have done since '92. And the power to persuade is a significant one because the kind of the party system, whip system, things like that, they don't function in the US system in the same way. So the president normally has to persuade people, win people over, be that people in the departments, be that members of the cabinet, be that members of Congress, be that the people. So there's lots of persuasion in there. Could be state governors where they're trying to get stuff to work. Then is there kind of the meat on the bones in terms of how the whole executive side works with the Executive Office of the President, EDEXCEL, including the National Security Council, the Office of Budget Management, Office of Management and Budget, sorry, and the White House office. So you need to know EXOP, NSC, OMB, and WHO, and you need to know what they do, how they do it, how effective they're being. Examples of all of that. You need to know the significance of all of this with reference to presidents since '92. So again, I say that having that profile of all the recent presidents, the things that where they've had successes, where they've had failures, is well worth having as part of your revision stuff to have all the stuff that in place. And then 3.3, we've got 3.3.1, the relationship between the presidency and the following institutions and why it varies. So why their relationship with Congress and Supreme Court varies. It's important to think about that in terms of the change of power during the term in office. So, for example, a newly elected president who won a massive kind of landslide victory in the Electoral College and in the popular vote, in their first 100 days or so, they will be enormously powerful and they will pretty much get their way because members of Congress are not going to want to step in the way if they. Or a president who's just come in, and there'll be lots of executive orders, and there will be kind of the big push on legislation. God, this is what the American people have voted for. I remember members of Congress are voted for either by their district or by their state, but the president is elected for by the whole of the USA, and so they've got that stronger mandate. As you go through, what then normally happens is that momentum starts to fall off. You get to the midterms. The president's party normally gets an enormous kicking in the midterms, and there was quite a notable thing where where Biden's administration had a slightly nicer time than it would have expected to in the midterms this time, but even so, they lost control of the House, and then in the second half of this term, Biden's had a much harder time with the Republican House to get stuff done. And there's been all the controversy over the Speaker and things like that. And then as we get towards the end of a term of office, particularly the end of a second term, then we see a president's power start to slip away. So it changes through their term in office. It will vary depending on what the situation is in Congress. Have they got united or divided government? Have they got a Supreme Court where the balance is in a way that would suit their party? So Biden would not feel that he's got favourable wind in that, in terms of a highly conservative court. And we've seen that particularly with the removal of Roe versus Wade and the controversies around that. And there are constitutional kind of limitations where there are things the presidents can't do because the Constitution restricts their power. So electoral cycle, divided government, all that kind of stuff. And again, it talks about significant limitations with reference to presidents since '92. One of the things I get my students to do is kind of like a non-scientific graph going through for each president of when they were more or less powerful, how powerful they were at different times. When you've got periods of united government, you've got presidents where again questions start to be asked about whether presidents are too powerful. Bush towards that middle bit of his term in office, when following 9/11, and then we've got kind of big electoral victories and him seemingly, I think, almost unlimited power. And then we've had other points where, for example, the later years of Obama, the later years of Trump, where they had enormously restricted powers because of the situation in Congress. So Trump essentially loses the ability to do pretty much anything by the end, and we see vetoes being overridden and stuff like that. So interpretation and debates for US presidency. So how effectively they achieve their aim, which is kind of a summary of all the stuff in the other bits of it. Whether there's an imperial presidency, again, that's one of the accusations leveled against Bush's presidency, or whether, again, you might see a really powerful president as a good thing. The extent of presidential accountability to Congress. So can Congress stuff executive orders are seen as a way they kind of get around of that. The role and power of the president in foreign policy. So do they absolutely dominate it? How much of a role does Congress play? And again, all of this, yet again, with reference to presidents since '92. Right, I've had to go really small on this because there's just so much in this section. So in section 4, the US Supreme Court and civil rights, we get the nature and role of the Supreme Court, appointment process of the Supreme Court, public policy in the Supreme Court, and then it goes on to the rights bit, so the protection of rights 4.4, race and rights 4.5, and then the debates in 4.6. So the nature and roles of the Supreme Court, we can see in 4.1, because there's been a question about US Constitution, depending more on interest groups than Supreme Court. Again, it's one which has brought this bit in with the Supreme Court. It's also brought interest groups, which are in section 5 in, and that kind of shows, particularly early on when they're asking questions on this, they tended to ask quite broad ones that covered various bits of the spec. 2021 was a lot narrower, a lot nicer, which was about president appointments to the Supreme Court. In 2021, we saw the question on affirmative action and minority participation in Congress, and which did the most significant job in promoting racial equality. And then we've got Congress has protected civil and constitutional rights more effectively than the Supreme Court, which we saw in the Congress one, but you can also say this is a debate about the role of the Supreme Court. Notably, again, so Supreme Court and rights are not in last year, and again, may well be due a comeback, particularly if we look, there is a gap, 4.3 and 4.4. So let's have a look at the bits of the spec in a bit more detail. So 4.1, the nature and role of the Supreme Court, the US Constitution, the independent nature of the Supreme Court, judicial review process. Judicial review is really important. So that goes all the way back to Marbury, Madison, and Fletcher versus Peck. But there's, I mean, it's a really big thing with Chief Justice Roberts, and again, he's not a big fan of judicial review. But this doesn't mean that his court hasn't done it. So there's lots of stuff that's looked at this recently. I mean, the big thing, it's overturning of Roe versus Wade would be a big bit in all of this. The appointment process, again, there's been a question on this before, doesn't mean there won't be one again. So strengths and weaknesses of the process, factors influencing presidential choice of nominee, and the current composition, ideological balance of the court. So you need your little profiles on all your Supreme Court justices, who appointed them when, where are they in that kind of scale of liberal and conservative, and the other kind of nuances between members of the court. So were they kind of originalists? Do they think that the Constitution should be interpreted in relevance to the time it's in? All those kinds of things. So there's so much controversy and interest in that over recent years in the US. Again, it would make an area for a really good question. I mean, the impact of Trump's appointments is one of the most significant things in US politics in recent years. So, and in 4.3, we've got the Supreme Court and public policy. So the impact of the Supreme Court on public policy in the US with a wide range of examples, including post-2005. So there's lots of bits of policy in areas that have been impacted on this, be it gun control, be it abortion, all kinds of things like that, where there's been the overturning of the ideas of affirmative action. All those ones are kind of examples of the Supreme Court kind of stepping into the idea of public policy. And this, again, a big thing under Chief Justice Roberts, this whole debate about judicial activism and judicial restraint. There are criticisms of both. What I often find when I teach this to students is that they tend to really like judicial activism when it's doing things that they ideologically agree with, and really dislike it when it's doing things that they ideologically disagree with. So, for example, if we look at the abortion one, you could see Roe versus the Wade as an example of judicial activism, and equally you could see its removal as an action of judicial activism. So judicial activism or restraint aren't necessarily one or other side of the political spectrum. It's about the role that the Supreme Court should or shouldn't take within the US system. And again, the links very much to things like the weakness of the amendment procedure and the overly strong amendment procedure, which is very difficult to do, and therefore, with what's happened with some of these key areas, then Congress doesn't seem to be able to get anywhere. You're definitely not going to get an amendment to the Constitution on lots of these key areas, things like gun control, abortion, all those kind of bits. You're going to go, well, how could we ever get an amendment through? Well, not as things stand, and therefore the decision by the Supreme Court takes on kind of even bigger and stronger importance. So 4.4 talks about the protection of civil liberties and rights in the US today. So it talks about rights protected by the Constitution, by the Bill of Rights, by subsequent constitutional amendments, so things like the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, rulings of the Supreme Court. Again, lots of stuff in all of that. Again, there's been the question before relating this to Congress. Does Congress do stuff to protect rights? Again, relating it to Section 5 as well. Do interest groups do stuff to protect rights? 4.5 is specifically on race and rights in contemporary US politics. So methods of influencing the effectiveness of racial rights campaigns and the impacts on current domestic policy. So things on voting rights, there's been lots of controversy of that with the conservative branch of the Republican Party seeming to wanting to kind of restrict voting rights, particularly in parts in the South. We saw affirmative action. I taught this, and then the Supreme Court changed the law on it. So there's lots of up-to-date stuff on that. And on representation, so looking at the degree of kind of representation for different racial groups in America within Congress and within state bodies and things like that is an important element of this. We've seen, for example, Biden having the most diverse cabinet in history. We've got kind of a big debate where there seems to be some fairly significant differences between the two major parties on this. 4.6 is the interpretations and debates of the US Supreme Court and civil rights. So political versus judicial nature of the Supreme Court. Has the Supreme Court become a political body rather than a judicial one? Again, the 3 appointments by Trump have really kind of fed into this. So living constitution ideology again versus originalism. So they should they just take the words as they are in the Constitution and stick to them strictly, or should it be a living constitution adapting to the way that society changes? How effective civil and constitutional rights have been upheld by the Supreme Court, and it's the effectiveness of this protection. So are rights being protected in America? There's lots of stuff from interest groups and others where they're talking about the rights of certain groups being under threat, and so what is being done to protect those. The extent of their powers and effectiveness and checks and balances. The successes and failures of measures to promote equality, including to affirmative action and immigration reform, two massively controversial topics in there. So affirmative action, again, the Supreme Court changed the ruling on that, where you can't have affirmative action based on race anymore, and the two parties are arguing a lot about immigration at the moment, which is one of the big issues of the 2024 election. So again, lots of good stuff for potential questions and debate in there. Section 5 is just enormous. So it's kind of like they kind of go, right, we're going to put a 5th section in the US one, and it's essentially the equivalent of, well, paper 1 in the UK. So it looks at elections and campaign finances. It looks at the political parties and their power. It looks at the conflicts within the parties. It looks at the different groups who support the parties. It then goes on to look at interest groups as well, and then it's also got its kind of broader debates. So on the elections in 2019, we had a question of procedures for electing US presidents and members of Congress. So 5.1.1 is our presidential elections, so that's in there. And then there was a debate, which again you could put in 5.3, you could put in 5.4 about the impact of interest groups in the Supreme Court on the US Constitution. In 2020, we've got the question on presidential power of persuasion, and that being more important than the policies and ideas of the political parties. So obviously, the policies and ideas of the political parties is part of that, and that's in 5.2.1. So then we've got voting behaviour in Congress, the divisions between and within the political parties, which filters into 5.2.2 as well as a bit of 5.2.1. So the divisions within the parties, the different factions within it. Interesting is voting behaviour within Congress. There hasn't been a voting behaviour generally one, which would come in the party supporters bit. So that might be an area it's worth thinking about. 2022, we've got interest groups and political parties influencing presidential elections. They do love to stick a bit of interest groups in everywhere, wherever they can in this one. And again, there's lots of stuff with your PACs and your super PACs and things like that having a massive impact on presidential elections. I think we've seen that particularly with the likes of Trump, who can go outside the normal bounds of the party and raise money elsewhere. And there are enormously powerful interest groups which play significant roles in elections by who they support and who they give money to. And then in 2023, we had a nice question on the failure to reform campaign finance and how that's a massive issue in the US electoral systems. So that, again, was a nice question and really quite confined to maybe one area of the spectrum rather than some of these other ones which kind of go, oh, I'm doing a question on interest groups, but I'm also doing parties and I'm also doing presidential elections, and it's kind of lots of stuff from all over. So to go through 5.1, so we've got electoral systems, so the presidential elections and their significance, the main process to elect a US president, including constitutional requirements, being in prison, or not being in prison is not one of them. Not being convicted is not one of them. It's all to do with age and residency and birth and all that kind of stuff. You've got the invisible primaries, which is kind of when the election campaign starts. Then you've got the primaries and the caucuses proper. Then you get the national conventions, which we'll be looking forward to in the summer, and then the electoral college and all the horrors of that, and what impact that has on the party system, which essentially creates a two-party system. The importance of incumbency on presidents seeking a second term, and generally speaking, incumbency works in almost all recent examples. Trump was really unusual in being a one-term president. Whether he'll be followed into that by Biden, we will find out in November. Campaign finance, which again was on last year, so with all the rules and regulations on that, including McCain-Feingold reforms of 2002 and Citizens United versus FEC in 2010. So again, a nice little bit of the spec. Really nice question on that last year. 5.2, the ideas and principles of the Democratic and Republican parties. So then 5.2.1, the distribution of power and changing significance of the parties. And it talks about the Democrats being progressive, calling for greater government intervention, including in the economy, and greater provision of social welfare, whilst the Republicans being conservative in attitude on social and moral issues, and this kind of culture war almost that's going on, this big divide in the US. There's loads of stuff happening with all of that. They tend to be more restricted on government intervention when it comes to things like the economy, whilst that's not 100% true, because they do also then want to protect American trade and jobs. And with, again, the whole Trump thing with the American First campaign would go in that, and making America great again. Now, I suppose acceptance of social welfare, I'm not sure how strong that is now. As a preference for personal responsibility, there is kind of wars going on within the Republican Party, though arguably Trump seems to have won that war, and there is big divides within the Democrats as well, particularly in terms of how far they go with the kind of progressive attitudes and intervention into welfare and health and stuff like that. And this is reflected in 5.2.2, where you look at the current conflicts and tendencies and changing power within the parties. So we're in the Democrats, where you've got some all kind of ultra liberals, and then you've got your moderates, and still there's remaining people like Joe Manchin, some of your remaining kind of conservative Democrats that are in there. In the Republicans, I'm not sure how much of the first group of this are still in there, our moderates, and then we get our social conservatives, which are a massive chunk of it, and our fiscal conservatives, who are more worried about how much the government is spending rather than kind of social issues. And there's lots of stuff shifting with that, and the big thing in kind of Republicans at the moment is the MAGA lot under Trump versus all the kind of more traditional parts of the party. The coalition of supporters is essentially what effect has influenced voting patterns. Again, this is super exciting in an election year. It's also a gap that they haven't asked a question on before. So presidential elections, you look at some in detail. I would suggest that you looked at the most recent one, the 2021. Look at how the role that race, religion, gender, and education had on that election. There's some really interesting stuff in there, though. It basically is going and finding the facts and figures, which will probably back up almost immediately what you would think would have been the different groups who voted different ways. It's one of those ones. We do a thing in my lessons where you do a kind of pen portrait of your typical Democrat voter and your typical Republican voter, and then you'll find that the data will match up and show that you're right, they voted those ways. So it's an interesting bit. There's loads of good data out there from the 2020 election. It'd be interesting to see whether this shifts or not in 2024, but definitely an area they could ask you in the exam. 5.3 is about interest groups, so their significance, their resources, their tactics, debates about their impact on democracy, when we've seen some questions on that in previous years. Influence methods and power of at least one single interest group, professional group, or policy group. So make sure you've gone and done your due diligence, do a deep dive into at least one pressure group. So it might be a group like the NRA, whoever you choose. Go and make sure that you've got lots of stuff on that. So examples you can use in essays. Then 5.4 is on interpretation and debates of US democracy and participation. So advantages and disadvantages of the electoral process in the electoral college. That would be wonderful. Wouldn't that be great if they did an electoral college question? The role of campaign finance, the difficulty in achieving effective reform, which they kind of asked on last year. The role of incumbency in elections, which again would make a really good question, both for presidency and for Congress. Incumbency rates in Congress are absolutely phenomenal, really, really high. The ways in which interest groups can influence the three branches of government policy creation, including the role of PACs and super PACs and their impact on democracy. So loads of debate on that. They seem to really, really like interest groups. They are very important in US politics, so you can kind of see why. Right, that's been a fairly mammoth one, but it is a massive specification, the USA one. So I hope that's been helpful to you. Check out the US politics playlist, which has got videos on all these, an enormous number of bits that I've gone through in far more detail. Good luck with the exam. If you don't subscribe, then please do. And hit like. Thank you very much for watching.